Back in 1995, the internet was still a frontier. Amazon was selling books out of a garage. Facebook, YouTube, Google, and smartphones didn't exist. Yet even in those early days, one simple invention was already becoming essential to the internet's future: the domain name. Instead of cumbersome long strings of numbers, users could simply type addresses like youtube.com into their browser. It was a simple idea, but it would become one of the foundations of the modern internet. And eventually, one company would find itself sitting at the center of it all. The company in question was VeriSign. Welcome back to Sense and Sensibility. Today, my friends in finance, let's talk about how VeriSign operates the registries for .com and .net, two of the most recognizable domain extensions in the world. Well more than 150 million .com domain names rely on infrastructure managed by the company. Every day, billions of internet queries pass through systems maintained by VeriSign. Yet despite its importance, most internet users have never heard its name. And maybe most incredibly of all, VeriSign has a contract to continue to provide those domains as long as they're willing to do so. And at their profit levels, they're more than willing to do so. Yet even though VeriSign is ingrained in the very essence of the internet, barely anyone has heard about the role they play. In order to answer the question on how VeriSign managed to wrest control of such a valuable toll road on the internet, in the first place, we have to go back and to the early days of the web. In 1995, VeriSign was spun out of the encryption company RSA Data Security, which was a pioneer in the encryption space. Once spun out, VeriSign's original business centered around digital certificates and authentication technologies, helping users and businesses establish trust online. At the time, security was one of the internet's weak points, and many people were worried about the security of their devices. However, VeriSign quickly became an important player in the space. Eventually, though, the opportunity that would ultimately define the company came through a series of acquisitions. During the absolute peak of the tech bubble in 2000, VeriSign acquired Network Solutions for $21 billion. Network Solutions was a company that held a unique position in the internet. Network Solutions had initially been responsible for registering domain names under contracts connected to the United States government. But as the commercial internet exploded in popularity, Network Solutions wrangled its way to managing some of the most important domain infrastructure in existence. In hindsight, it is obvious VeriSign made a mistake in acquiring Network Solutions at such inflated tech bubble prices. But this act also set up VeriSign to inherit something absolutely extraordinary: operational control of the .com and .net registries. To understand why this mattered, it helps to understand the difference between a registrar and a registry. Registries are companies like GoDaddy, Namecheap, Squarespace, and 2,800 other accredited registrars. They sell domain names directly to customers. Essentially, they would be considered the retail end, and who have to do all the messy and competitive work of selling individual domain names to consumers and businesses. But VeriSign operates one level deeper. It maintains the definitive database which tells the internet which .com domains exist and where they point. When someone registers a new .com domain, that registration ultimately flows into systems operated by VeriSign. So to be clear, VeriSign doesn't own a single .com website besides the verisign.com website itself. Instead, it operates the infrastructure that makes the .com system function. So in this scenario, VeriSign operates as a wholesaler who takes a fee whenever a registrar makes a sale to a customer. You might be tempted to extend this metaphor and assume that, like a typical wholesaler in the physical world, VeriSign would not get to mark up their product much and have minimal markups. But in actuality, VeriSign marks up their products by a large amount, and it's really the registrars that are in a cutthroat industry with low profitability. As the internet matured and VeriSign's profits from controlling .com and .net grew, questions naturally emerged about who should control and profit from this critical infrastructure. But ultimately, the only organization that has much power to change anything is ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. This nonprofit public benefit corporation is in charge of overseeing and regulating the domain name system, and consequently, is the company that VeriSign has to interact with the most. A lot of the criticism of VeriSign was based on the idea that no single company should possess such monopolistic powers. But on the other side, replacing the operator of the world's most important domain registry could create enormous risks. And all of these decisions carry much more importance when virtually every person who accesses the internet relies on VeriSign every day. Throughout the years, VeriSign's position survived challenges, contract reviews, and scrutiny from regulators. The company continued operating the registries while maintaining the infrastructure that internet users rarely notice but constantly depend on. In September of 2003, VeriSign published a new service called SiteFinder. On the surface, it sounded like a relatively harmless idea that would be a minor inconvenience for users and a sizable boon to the company. Normally, if you type in a .com or .net address that didn't exist, your browser would simply return an error. To VeriSign, that represented millions of missed opportunities every single day. So the company changed one of the internet's most fundamental behaviors. Instead of displaying an error, every unregistered or mistyped .com and .net domain was automatically directed to a VeriSign-owned webpage featuring search results and advertisements. From a business perspective, it was a pretty clever idea. Rather than allowing the traffic to disappear, VeriSign could monetize it for some extremely high margin revenue. But what seemed like an ordinary business decision quickly turned into one of the biggest controversies in internet history. The backlash was immediate. Engineers warned that SiteFinder broke software that depended on the traditional domain not found response. Internet service providers criticized the change. But beneath the technical complaints was a much larger concern. For years, critics had worried about what might happen if one private company held too much influence over one of the internet's most important pieces of infrastructure. SiteFinder appeared to answer that fear. With a single decision, VeriSign had changed the behavior of virtually every non-existent .com and .net address on the planet. This episode demonstrated just how much authority came with operating the world's most valuable domain registry. For all of these reasons, ICANN quickly asked VeriSign to suspend the service voluntarily. Of course, VeriSign refused. So the ICANN formally sent a letter in October of that year that said VeriSign must shut down SiteFinder or else the ICANN would find VeriSign in violation of their contracts. And ultimately, ICANN could have potentially even tried to take away .com and .net from VeriSign. That same day, VeriSign did actually take down SiteFinder. However, they claimed they were doing it to survey their options and still rejected ICANN's authority to force them to stop operating SiteFinder. And they weren't backing down without a fight. Instead, the company filed a lawsuit against ICANN, arguing that the organization had exceeded its contractual authority by forcing SiteFinder offline. Although SiteFinder itself disappeared after only a few weeks, the legal battle that followed proved far more important than the service ever was. Once VeriSign sued ICANN for trying to force VeriSign to shut down SiteFinder, things bogged down pretty quick. The lawsuit dragged out over months and blossomed into a full-blown legal battle over ICANN's power over registries. Instead of allowing the dispute to continue for who knows how long until the courts made a decision, VeriSign and ICANN reached a settlement that reshaped their relationship. The agreements that followed granted VeriSign significantly stronger contractual protections than most observers expected. Most importantly of all, VeriSign received the presumptive renewal rights for the .com and .net registry. In practical terms, that meant that as long as the company continued to meet its contractual obligations, it had a strong expectation of remaining the operator of the registries. Instead of repeatedly competing with other firms to keep the registry, VeriSign now occupied a far more secure position that enabled much more comfortable profits. The agreements also clarified pricing provisions and other important subjects. But the important thing was that VeriSign kind of showed I can who's boss, while also substantially reducing one of the biggest uncertainties surrounding the business. By 2005, it was clear SiteFinder had failed at its original goal of creating revenue for VeriSign. Yet the events it set in motion helped create an even stronger foundation for VeriSign's future. The controversy taught VeriSign an important lesson. The internet would tolerate a private company operating critical infrastructure, but it would not tolerate that company using its privileged position to aggressively expand into adjacent businesses. From that point forward, VeriSign embraced a remarkably disciplined strategy. Rather than trying to ruthlessly cut costs in its operation of the registries, it focused on something much simpler: operating the registry with exceptional reliability, raising prices when permitted under its agreements, and returning enormous amounts of cash to shareholders. Even its other registry businesses like .cc and .name are barely paid attention to in comparison to .com and .net. Unless it's .net or .com, it really isn't VeriSign's focus. In hindsight, this restraint may have been one of the smartest business decisions the company ever made. What emerged was an incredibly successful position. Unlike most companies, VeriSign doesn't need to convince customers to choose its product over competitors. If someone registers a .com domain, VeriSign receives its registry fee regardless of which registrar sells the domain. Whether the customer uses one registrar or another, VeriSign remains in the middle. This creates an extraordinary business model. The company requires relatively modest capital investment compared to the importance of the service it provides. Once the infrastructure is built and maintained, each additional domain registration generates highly attractive economics. Economies of scale are certainly present in this business and are being taken full advantage of. An additional cherry on top is that domains tend to renew. A business that owns a website cannot simply abandon its domain without consequences. Companies build brands, customer relationships, search rankings, and reputations around their web addresses. That creates recurring revenue that is both predictable and durable. Imagine owning a toll booth on a busy highway. Now imagine that the traffic on the highway is steadily increasing year after year. That is the appeal of VeriSign. The company collects a sizable fee from an enormous amount of domain registrations and renewals. Collectively, they generate billions of dollars in revenue. The economics become even more impressive when combined with VeriSign's pricing power. The current contract is structured to allow VeriSign to raise prices 7% a year in the last 4 years in every 6-year contract. Historically, VeriSign usually takes the full price increase allowed in its contract because the value of a person, company, or organization gets from having a recognizable domain name is much, much larger than the cost of the domain name. If it's $10, $15, or even $30, millions of people would still pay for the rights to use these domain names. Over the years, VeriSign has supercharged its returns, not just through raising prices and harnessing growing consumer demand. Management at VeriSign have also used another powerful tool: share repurchases. Over many years, VeriSign has aggressively bought back its own stock, reducing the number of shares outstanding and increasing each remaining shareholder's ownership percentage. Instead of pursuing endless acquisitions or sprawling expansion projects, much of the company's excess cash has been returned to shareholders through buybacks. In addition, VeriSign also pays a dividend above 1% to directly return cash to shareholders, while the share buybacks are also happening. This combination of recurring revenue, high margins, limited capital requirements, consistent dividends, and aggressive repurchases has made VeriSign one of the most admired business models in the market. But of course, no business is without risk. The internet is still evolving. As time has gone on, more and more alternative domain extensions have emerged, with new ones still being added. We don't know if new technologies may change how users navigate online. Artificial intelligence especially could alter the way people discover information. And of course, there is always a chance that increased regulatory scrutiny could occur and jeopardize VeriSign's contract with ICANN. And while .com remains the dominant global domain extension, future growth is not likely to mirror the explosive expansion of the early internet era. Yet despite those challenges, VeriSign remains responsible for one of the most valuable pieces of digital infrastructure ever created. Railroads owned the tracks that connected cities, and utility companies built networks that powered homes. But VeriSign found a different kind of infrastructure, a critical layer of the internet itself. And what makes them such a special company is that they are able to wrest away control of the .com and .net and make sure they are able to capture a sizable amount of the value that they are in charge of operating. Most companies in VeriSign's position would probably have been relegated to be a replaceable company that provides the back-end infrastructure for a slim margin, while the registrars made decent profits and ICANN being able to take the lion's share of profits. But instead, VeriSign took the lion's share, while 20 cents a domain was given to ICANN. 20 cents! VeriSign did an incredible job making themselves indispensable to the functioning of the internet, and indispensable to the world. Most internet users will never think about the systems behind a .com address. But every time a business renews its domain, every time a new website is launched, and every time one of those familiar addresses remains online, VeriSign's quiet role in the background continues. Thanks for watching. Remember, this isn't investment advice, just stuff you should know. Please like, share, and subscribe so that you and I can continue our investing journey together.